remaking the city in the shadow of the Olympics produce a lot of dead space.
Okay. Well, thank you, Toby. That was great. And I agree. I agree with everything Toby said about Richard Florida in particular, but also the discursive game which has been played with us over the idea of the creative industries for so long. So I'll leave that to one side. But I just want to make a couple of remarks about things that Toby's talk brought to mind. One was that it's just been announced, someone emailed me today, great excitement, to tell me that Marseille is going to be a city of culture soon. Now, of course, Marseille is one of the African cities in France. And on my way here, I was reading a piece by Andrew Hussey, who, as you probably know, writes about Paris very eloquently. And he was writing about when he went into the banlieue in November last year and met somebody called Kevin there. And Kevin was called Kevin because Kevin doesn't want to be thought of as French, because Kevin is North African French and knows that the Parisians hate him because he lives in the banlieue on the outskirts of Paris, and he's on the outer, he's outside the inner city, the creative, if you like, gorgeous Parisian city. He's on the outside of that. So just call me Kevin, and then I don't have to be French at all. But of course, then we think about David Beckham standing on top of that bus in Beijing, kicking that ball, and did you see that really excited volunteer who got it? That was a good moment. That was the best Olympic moment, actually. The volunteer nearly pushing a PLA soldier over to get the ball. That was fantastic. That was Olympian. And I just thought it's funny because Kevin's called Kevin because he really loves David Beckham and Britain, and Britain is in France, and yet if you're in Britain and you're running an allotment, Ian Sinclair has referred to the allotments, and that allotment saga in London was quite a big thing, particularly at the beginning of this year, because there are people who have allotments and they are being cleared out. And there were things like articles in the press about, these are the kinds of cooking that we do, and we can't do this cooking anymore. And when you think about that whole big sort of Jamie Oliver, this is how we are going to be a healthy new Britain, well, you are, but we're going to take your allotments away, so you'll have to buy it in Sainsbury's now. It does all begin to fall apart a bit and become just a little bit hypocritical. So, I agree. I would also say I was in Beijing for the first week of the Olympics. I didn't get to see anything because I didn't have any tickets, because I wasn't one of the La La Due, and I couldn't get one of those yellow T-shirts that got you in. For those who weren't there or don't know what La La Due are very nice old ladies, with yellow T-shirts who have been bussed in to fill up the stands, because it's a bit embarrassing because the corporates haven't turned up to take their tickets to watch the softball in the Ukrainians play the Angolans at softball or something, and so there's nobody in the stands, so let's bring in the La La Due. And the old ladies don't know the rules of softball, but they've got the yellow T-shirts, so they'll go, jayo, at great length, because they've got the yellow T-shirts. And it's completely farcical, it's crazy. And I know Pung is here, who has talked quite amusingly about things that the La La Due were taught to say in particular sports, so maybe you want to tell us about that. And I suppose one other comment I'd like to make, just again in the context of the Beijing Olympics, was, I was in Chengdu with a colleague about a year and a half ago, and we were talking to, 2 years ago now, and we were talking to the developer who had the idea of Lux Hills, which is a middle-class gated community development based on Southern Californian developments of the same ilk. It's very comfortable, it's very nice. It's about an hour and a half drive outside Chengdu. It's down a long road which is now called the Southern Creative Corridor, and there's going to be all these creative corridor-y things there, and animation films and all that stuff. And he said to me, I did this long interview about, why do you think your development's, going to work? And he said, I don't know, I'm sure it will, I'm sure. Do you think you could come and be my brand advisor, because you come from Australia and you know about creative industries? Could you come and just advise me how I should set up a real community here? Okay, build a library, I don't know. But it was, and now of course we all know what's happened in Sichuan recently, and it suddenly all becomes just a little bit naive, really. And of course the people we actually spoke to who were living and paid a great deal of money to live in this development were saying, we're only going to be here for a couple of years because all we are doing is escaping the pollution. and we know that the city's going to catch up with us, so we're going to have to move a bit further. Now, ironically, one old man, not old man, I beg his pardon, he's in his 60s, said he was going to move as far as the mountain. Now, the mountain's fell over earlier this year. So the whole thing becomes really quite frenetic and actually tragic when you unpick it the way Toby did. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Toby, for a very stimulating talk, and thank you, David and the CCR, for my invite. I'm from Britain, although I'm not called Kevin. In fact, I'm from London, so I'm paying for the next Olympic Games. Not all myself, there's quite a lot of us. And of course, like all the recent Olympics, London is committed to the Cultural Olympiad and to generating a set of creative cultural activities. But here's the thing, and this is to go back into Ian Sinclair territory. I don't know how well any of you know London, but to the east of London, there has been, for some years, it's been a bit of a quarter for artists, not successful, not rich artists, but young art students, the creative people of today and tomorrow. And as the areas they live in, as always happens with art students, become fashionable, they've tended to drift to the east from Aldgate, Clerkenwell and Spitalfields, which have all now gone up market, further east towards Hackney, London Fields and the perimeter of the Olympic site. Around the Olympic site, which as I'm sure you'll appreciate, especially if you're from Sydney, is many, many acres, there's a large blue fence. Every morning at 7 o'clock, somebody from the Olympic Games organisation cycles around that perimeter, it's several miles, in order to check whether there has been any graffiti. And if they find graffiti, they call it the location on the mobile phone, and people come around on a quad bike with large pots of blue paint to paint out what the mark has been. Now, I was ambivalent about the Olympic Games. I've been in print and in sessions like this a critic of the Olympic Games, but I've also acknowledged some of the beautiful, joyous, exciting things that can happen. And with it coming to my city, I felt very ambivalent. But I must say the fence has begun to knock me off the fence, perversely. I find this very disturbing, that you are operating with a discourse of creativity and culture, and you want to generate these things, and this is not just a spectacle, it's for the people, and yet this fence stands as this horrible divide between the construction within and the, in effect, voiceless without. I understand this fence is soon to be covered with the gay slogans of the Olympics, and more significantly, the banners, names, logos, and commercial messages of the sponsors. And it's certainly my hope that the artists of the East End will arrange themselves a bike, and a quad bike, and a bottle of blue paint, and strive to preserve the aesthetic purity of the fence, which at the moment the London Organising Committee seems so committed to.
Okay. Thank you, Professor David Rollins, and thank you, Professor Toby Miller. I think this is a quite unique opportunity for me to come just seeing, I think today it's the last day of the Paralympic, and now from the announcement, and now it's the time that the live broadcasting of closing ceremony. So it's really the last day. We hope it's not the last day of Chinese 100 years Olympic dream. But yes, that's the slogan of the. I remember it's on the first day of opening ceremony on August 8th. It's the starting point of Chinese 100 years dream for Olympic. But for me now, it's not a remarks for Professor Toby Miller. It's just a quick response from the perspective of mediating Olympic in China. Talking about the creativity influenced by Olympic, I think in China we can divide it into two parts from the mediating perspective. One is from the national level. from the individual. I think from the very first beginning of China, when we successfully beating for the Beijing Olympic, all the individual people, or we may say most of the individual people from the bottom of heart that will cheering for this Olympic, and they will have their own creativity or the creative ideas to serve for this Olympic. But it's a pity we still said that from the media or the Chinese media, they over-presented for the creativity from the national level. So that's what we will see from, we will see a magnificent opening ceremony, but it's a pity we still see too much about the national pride. We see the population, but we haven't seen the individual stories. So we think the mediating problems for the Olympic. So that is the first. And also an interesting story is that for the closing ceremony, there's 8 minutes presentation from London. And in the internet, there's a lot of Chinese internet users that criticize the London, even the mayor, they take a very easy way. Actually, they're quarreling a lot about that because the Chinese people are accustomed to this kind of organized or systematically appearance in the media. So that's why we think it's a pity. Actually, we can pay more attention to the creativity by Olympic from the individual people. So that's what we will talk further tomorrow. But that's what I respond for that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll open the. I want to come and.
I was trying to get rid of Billy Bragg's nose. I mean, no offence to Billy, but I think Bill Bowles better than this schnoz.
Okay, well the floor is now open for comments and questions.
Thank you. I find it strange to have the Olympic Games sort of conflated with the Richard Florida thesis about the cultural class. They seem to me to be quite different phenomena. I mean, my memory of the Olympics in Sydney, and this seems to be the case with London too, is that the cultural class, for want of a better expression, sort of people in this room, were at best indifferent to the Olympics and mostly hostile, in fact, to the whole project, up until the moment, of course, of the opening ceremony. And we realised we weren't going to be embarrassed worldwide on a cultural level. I mean, the Cultural Olympiad, of course, which we had too, was fundamentally an add-on to try and buy people, to make people like us part of the project, but it was barely even a sideshow to the whole thing. The Olympics in Sydney was totally a product of political populism, and I presume it is in England too. It just seems to me to have a completely different logic to what Richard Florida is talking about. And, you know, as I say, it needs to be discussed in quite a different way. I mean, I agree with a lot of the criticisms that Toby made of it. I think are very opposite. But again, I'm not sure the two have to live with each other.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's a good point. And a couple of things though in response. If you look at, I guess, where Olympics happen all the time, which is in the area of funding for football, baseball, basketball and hockey teams in the United States, right, where there is a complete disarticulation of place from team, much greater than you're used to, say, in Australia, where it goes on as well, but infinitely greater, because teams just pick up and leave a city, keeping only their nickname, right, because of new media markets, bigger media markets, definitely related to the creative sector, but most importantly because they basically hold one city's finances ransom to another city's finances. So the owner of a baseball team will say, unless the city pays for a new stadium and gives it to me, I will take my team to another city that will, and where there's a bigger media market, and I can get more revenue from television coverage of my team. In almost every case, there is a plebiscite held in the city that is either trying to retain the team or get the team to discuss whether or not it's worth spending all this money. Public opinion polls that are taken from the minute the announcement is made about either the attempt to recapture the team or get the team show massive popular opposition to the expenditure of money on the stadium, new stadium, either from the aspirant city or the existing city. Huge campaigns are then run in the 3 or 4 weeks beforehand. Many threats are issued. Claims are made in particular about new jobs that will be generated, about the fact that families with high levels of educational attainment, corporations with large opportunities for job increases, new industries that will not be polluting, will all be attracted as a consequence of a cluster of factors, including the existence of high-quality sporting facilities, but also ballet, etc., etc., etc. So I actually think the link, in that sense, is very intense. In addition to which, one of the things that allows you to get an Olympics, apart from political shenanigans and so on, is telecommunications infrastructure. Because the Olympics go wherever NBC, which paid almost $1 billion for the rights to Beijing, says it wants them to go, in terms of the quality of material that it will be able to provide to major corporations that advertise on it. And that whole issue of telecommunications infrastructure is in itself intimately related to the technology talent issues that I raised. So I think there is a connection, but I take your point about needing to question it. And I take your point as well about saying that the so-called chattering classes, if you like, are often anti-sport or anti-Olympics or whatever, and would see their own interest in the creative and cultural sectors as being in contradistinction to the Olympics. But I think they're actually quite wrong in that. And I also think the idea that the Olympics are necessarily always and everywhere populist is wrong. I think once they're there, there's a lot of evidence that, if you like, ordinary people love them. But when they're being thrown out of their homes, they don't. I was living in Fremantle during the period running up to the 1986 America's Cup. When the America's Cup came, people loved it, but the people who loved it in Fremantle were those who had not been thrown out of their homes, most of whom were working class and had to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think the distinction has to be made between the self-identifying chattering classes and their relationship to the Olympics, which is ambivalent, and the creative classes, of whom they well may be a member, the creative classes as articulated by Richard Florida, and their interests are very much linked, as Toby has described, to the Olympics. And what is really good about the Beijing example is that that was made completely explicit, and that the government very clearly tied their creative industries policy to the Olympics and to the rollout through Zhang Yimou's opening ceremony and so weiter from there on. So those connections were absolutely explicit. The development of industry for this class of people and this kind of industrial expertise is going to be played through this event. And yes, it will also be populist, and yes, it will also have very strong overtones and undertones of nationalism, but this is the industrial outcome that we will achieve. So it was very explicit. I think it's there in all of them, but Beijing gave the lie, or not gave the lie, so it showed that up. So.
Yeah, I think you're right about this separation of the cultural side from the chattering classes. And if it wasn't there already, certainly in England, the moment that arts organisations discovered they were already losing a huge tranche of money losing the Olympics, that's wider. It's probably wider in England than many places. The populist side of it, I think one of the real puzzles is that actually, why is the Olympics popular? Because all its component sports are not particularly. In England, you can rarely draw a crowd of more than 20,000 for an athletics event, and that's only twice a year. Swimming, you'd be lucky to pull in 5,000 or 6,000. Boxing, similarly, apart if it's a major professional title bout. And the other sports, minimal audiences. So there's no indicators of public demand for the component parts of this event, which make it very different from the World Cup, where football as a sport does have a huge demand. And Toby's right, I think. Certainly in England it was the case. There was no groundswell of enthusiasm for bidding. Once the bid was underway, it was a desperate need to mobilise some popular support. And once, of course, the bid is successful, there's a certain degree of excitement about it. But certainly in England, it wasn't a bid catering to a demand that was already there. It's very little evidence of that. So it's actually something very odd about this centrifugal appeal of the Olympics, centripetal appeal, I should say.
Okay.
David, should we take a few comments before we respond?
Sorry. Yeah. I think that's a good idea. Yeah. So some more feedback, comments, questions.
Yeah, thanks Toby for your rallying cry to just say no to Richard Florida. I'm just wondering if it's really as simple as that though. I mean, and I suppose my question really follows on from the previous one. And I'm thinking about, I completely agree with what you said about the necessity of anti-Olympic movements and so on. But is it really just resistance against the Olympian-sized forces of capital? And I'm thinking of a city like Berlin. I mean, Berlin prides itself on being the city where every Richard Florida campaign has failed. And yet it's a complete economic disaster. It's got 20% unemployment, the city's bankrupt, but it's a thriving, culturally interesting, creative city. And precisely because it does offer what you mentioned in terms of what Derrida and Simmel said a city should be, which is a place of refuge, a place of anonymity, a place of doing things differently. I'm just wondering if we need some more nuanced accounts of our anti-Florida rhetoric. We need more nuanced accounts of what is wrong with culturalisation of cities and urban regeneration, and whether it's, we don't really need Richard Florida now. His presence is everywhere. You go to every local government, and there's someone who's already drafting their treatise post Richard Florida. So I'm thinking we need to really come at this from another angle, a different perspective.
Trying to get a few people, is that what Gary was suggesting? Get a few questions at a time. Anybody else?
Just quickly, I was just wondering where the Paralympics fits within this critique. That's actually a genuine question. Just wondering in terms of sort of critique of Olympic movements and so on, partly because it's been a question that was thrown at me recently, to be blunt. I don't think the response was particularly adequate, so I was just wondering what we had to say.
My question was really just responding to comments about the way that the sports that are involved in the Olympics aren't particularly popular. And just watching the Beijing Olympics, it just struck me, noticing that there weren't a lot of people there, and just the whole sort of feel of it in terms of it being a media event. That the World Cup, the rugby, the tennis. There's a sort of proliferation of other events that are, mediatised in perhaps a slightly different way, that I just had a sense with the Beijing Olympics that there was something different happening in terms of, you know, it's kind of maybe the cuteness or the folksiness of it. It was just a sense that I had, and it became very clear to me that those sports were atypical in some way, or you know, they're the sports we've always known, but they had a different feel, slightly different feel to me. Anyway, I just thought there's kind of a polarity going on between these other events which are taking perhaps precedence or dominance of becoming part of the calendar of sports and the media, and then the Olympics, which sort of fits in or slots in.
Okay, there's three. Before we forget what the questions were, any member of the panel would like to answer one? Anyone?
Well, someone's got to answer Fiona.
I'll be there.
Thank you very much. I don't think I can actually, but I mean, yeah, of course. But I'm not quite sure though that it's an either or. I think, you know, you can do broad brush critiques of what's happening in the Olympics, and in some ways they're easy to do, but in other ways they're not, because it is an overwhelmingly successful brand, and so and so is Florida, and that sort of does need to be said. And it's actually sometimes not quite, it's not said as clearly as one might expect it to be said in many quarters. I mean, you know, you can hear it mumbled, but it's not actually that often said. So, and I guess having, you know, just come through the Beijing Olympics, where Zhang Yimou is the brand and is the kind of, you know, the Florida figure, if you like, in his way, it's just a bit of a relief to hear it said, I guess. But I suppose what I mean, I'd like to throw it back to you a bit and say, you know, so what do we say about Berlin? I mean, I've just been reading Kira Kosnick's work on Berlin, where she's saying that, if you like, the argument for Berlin's sort of cultural, not anonymity, cultural sort of inclusiveness is really quite shallow. And she says, you know, that people's attempts, if they are not of Berlin in a certain way, to create a cultural space in which they can feel comfortable are often very short-lived and fall over, because the cultural authorities don't allow them to be seen as art, so they're always ethnic cultural activities rather than art. And so there are problems in Berlin as well, not just around the economy, which, as you say, is a basket case, but also actually around art and culture and you know, the Symbol City also. So, you know, it's not that, you know, Florida is, just because Florida's you know, irritating means everyone else is right. So, but how do you allow a city to become creative if you're not using the brand mechanism, but you're also recognising that on the ground there's lots of ordinary local racisms that are institutionalised, which also, you know, make it stumble?
Yeah, I was thinking of Mexico City when you were talking, Stephanie. Those of you who don't know, it's a city that has more people in it than the whole of this country does. And one of the things that makes it incredibly vibrant and rich, and also terrifying and hopeless, even though its name is the City of Hope in Mexico, is because it stresses and embodies and lives out contradictions in a way that the Olympics, in its discourse, rarely allows, in a way that the creative industry's ideas rarely allow. So to give you a very quick example, Mexico is dominated by an iconography of state building, of nation building, borrowing on the ideas of Antonio Gramsci directly. So the idea is there is a thing called the national popular, and the national popular, as per Gramsci, for any leftover Marxists in the room, will be embodied in the figure of the indigenous worker, male, who will be heroized in every town square throughout the country, but especially in the city, in ways that look exactly like socialist realism but applied to indigenous people. So there is this locus of what the nation can be, and specifically what the city is in all its grandeur, that is in this pre-Columbian subject, this man who embodies all the nation could possibly be before the time of European invasion, conquest. But if you go to look at the centres of power, there are no people whatsoever in the centres of power who look like the heroic worker figure whom you find in every town square made as a statue. And the people who look like those figures are the armed guards policing the estate, and they're the people who look like that who are trying to get into the estate clandestinely and illegally. And one of the extraordinary aspects to what they call interculturalism, they eschew multiculturalism, what they call interculturalism is the way in which that grand contradiction between this tumultuous national iconography and the reality of national power, how that grand contradiction is played out on a daily basis in this city of, you know, depending on how you measure it, between 20 and 24 million people. And those contradictions themselves come to light because of the forces of capital that push people away from agricultural living and towards these chaotic centres. If you go back a century, 10% of the world's population lived in cities. Now it's over 50. Why is that? It's because of the spread of industrial and finance capital and all the opportunities and perils that that entails. There will never be a functionalist model of the easy articulation of all those people in that small amount of time, in those tiny spaces. And that's why one has to mount critiques of every simple model that comes forward to try to give an answer to that, whether it's the feel-good of the Olympics or the one-size-fits-all fix of the creative industries discourse.
Can I come in on the how the games looked? That's I think, a really interesting question, because how they look, of course, depends on which bits you see, and of course how you're looking as well. But I can just contribute 3 different ways I saw bits of the Olympics on television. One was in France, and if people know, did very well in the handball. And suddenly handball was everywhere. Every time you saw a news bulletin, it was handball, and you saw the same clips endlessly recycled. And it could have felt, if you'd come to it cold, that this was really the major centrepiece of the games. You know, they came far further up the news agenda than, say, the rather trivial matters of the athletics that France had been doing rather poorly in. And then I saw a bit of the Olympics on a big screen in one of the central streets in Beijing, at Whannel, yeah. It was the day after the opening ceremony, and I hadn't got tickets to go and see anything live, so I thought I'll go and explore the city and hopefully find a big screen, and I can see people watching it on the big screen. Now, it was very pleasant down there. There were little sort of temporary kiosks with seats where you could buy a beer or a coffee and sit, and the screen was there so you could see it. But it was showing highlights of the previous day's opening ceremony, and also highlights of the news coverage of Premier Hu Jintao meeting a whole series of foreign dignitaries. Now, it just so happens I saw that live the day before, and it wasn't, for me, I don't speak Chinese, it wasn't riveting television after a while, but it was quite fascinating. But I sensed, although I'm not an ethnographer, that the people in the cafe were not riveted by this, and it was not really what they wanted to see. In fact, I had a strong collective sense, what we in the cafe wanted to see was live sport, any live sport. But the whole point is, we want to see what's happening now. And I think that's an incredibly important part of the appeal of sport, is that you see what's happening now and nobody can tell you what's going to happen. Now, if I can just throw in the third one, see, one person who's mentioned the Paralympics. I haven't seen much of the coverage of the Paralympics, but I've been here in Australia and I caught a bit on the news. And what I thought was extraordinary in the highlights was they somehow managed to frame it or cut it or something so that you would barely know this is a sport that involves people who have disabilities. Yeah? It was very strange. There was one shot of the wheelchair basketball, but otherwise you saw a race in which it wasn't clear that there were limbs missing. Now, I think there's a really strong cultural taboo there, which the Paralympics are tickling away at, and it's the severed body. Certainly in Britain, news programmes will not show images of a severed body. The image of a body that's been divided, been broken, is very shocking. And in all sorts of cultural ways, we shy away from the notion that the kind of protective layer of the skin can be severed and the bits of the body divided. Now, in the Paralympics, forces us as viewers to confront those uneasy sights quite often. And it's actually, I think, quite interesting to watch as the Paralympics becomes more of a television event, how television handles that.
What I want to add is that also interesting about the agenda setting that media choose. We actually followed the media report for more than 2 months since the very beginning of the torch relay ceremony from March 24. So it's just 2 cases that we can share. One is that from the torch lighting ceremony, the Italian media, no matter the left wing or right wing, you will find in the evening news, there is more report or media coverage about China-related topic, and the position is all on the very prime time for the whole 13 minutes. But you will find that the position from the very beginning for the last 1 month, they reached the high or the highest audience rate from the it's when the torch in London, Paris, and it disappeared when it's go inside China after Hong Kong, and then reached the prime time after the earthquake. So you will find that the position or the agenda set is nothing related with Olympic itself. It's according to what's the violence happened together with the Olympic, the torch. And the second case is that after the opening ceremony of Olympic, we also follow this kind of media coverage, one from the NBC Evening News, another is from CCTV. So you will find also the 2 different ways to interpreting. For example, China chose August 8 and 8 p.m. as the time. So there's media especially explain why China choose this special time and it's a lucky time for China. And NBC also give an explanation for that. They're talking about, okay, this is a lucky time, and so the time when the baby was born, it's called the Olympic baby. But on the same time, it's also a number with bad luck. So they made some special counting. For example, the Sichuan earthquake, if you counting the number of the date, it's 8. And also some other disasters. So it's a 2 totally different presentation. So a lot of this kind of case, which is quite interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Qing. I might just make just a quick comment about the Paralympics, and I agree with the comment that that many people struggle with how to read it, and I noticed that I was watching one television program recently where people said they were uncomfortable to see, seeing sprinters, for example, with amputees who are amputees falling over, that they found all this bad television and they just couldn't watch it, somehow offensive. And then it occurred to me, well, but we see able-bodied people getting injured too, and we see things that we may not necessarily like. Why is that choice really being made? And so I think there is a lot more to learn about that area. A number of people I know think that the para part of Paralympic stands for paraplegic. They actually don't see it as para, it means para, alongside of. And I understand that apart from the kinds of degree of discomfort that we have, that Gary mentioned about the body, that this is particularly strong in China, that there's something of a taboo around people, being shown who were not able. And it seems to me that maybe that's something good that came out of the Olympics. It seems that there's been a bit of a shift in this, and that the Paralympics have actually been much more successful in Beijing than people thought, and that there is maybe a bit of a change there in terms of attitudes to people with disabilities, I should say, and finally that might mean, if you're talking about cities, that Beijing and other Chinese cities and cities around the world might be made more livable for people with disabilities. So, maybe it will have some kind of tangible benefit.
On the disability score, interesting differences in the way things are being covered in US television at the moment. So if you go back to September 11th, 2001, when I was living in New York City, I was there for 11 years, and all those things happened in my neighborhood and I saw it all. But if you were watching television in the United States, you didn't see people jumping from the World Trade Center. Unless you're watching Spanish language television, which is the highest rating television in the United States, in which case you did. And the reason is that there's a cultural difference assumed by television producers that folks of Latino backgrounds are more prepared to see greater physical violence in real time than others. So there's a lot of coverage every night under the old journalistic moniker of if it bleeds, it leads, but infinitely more graphic than you would get on any of the Anglo stations.
They didn't stop the bullfights when the Mexico City games were on, you reckon?
Pardon?
They didn't stop the bullfights.
Right.
Right.
It's a bullfight question.
Yeah. Mexico City.
Right, absolutely. So there's a fascination, and similarly with the coverage of the Paralympics, there's a much more graphic display of what's going on and the troubles people face on Spanish language television than there is on English language television, because the culture takes a different attitude to the body issues that Gary was mentioning. And just very quickly on your question about popularity and folksiness, I think there's something very interesting there. Of course, the Olympics aren't static in their view of what counts as a sport. Sports come and go. So baseball and softball have run into trouble recently and are sort of on the way out. And this is partly because baseball wasn't prepared to differentiate itself sufficiently from softball and be more macho in struggles with the IOC over what counts as popular and what counts as representative. But there is something, I think, rather different and rather interesting about the Olympics in this particular contradiction, and that is that on the one hand, you can't compete unless you're part of a collective. I can't go along and say I can run the 100 metres very quickly, please let me participate. I have to be selected by a nation. Right? It's entirely through that conduit. And yet, by contrast with most mediated sports that are popular around the world, it's not really about teams, it's much more about individuals. So of course there's golf, of course there's tennis, primarily individual contests, but most of the sports that are massively popular, and football is the obvious one, but the other kinds of football and cricket and baseball and so on, and hockey, are collective sports. The Olympics has this paradoxical contradiction at its heart. It must be selected by the nation as a collectivity, but most of the sports people love to watch, things like the 1500 metres track, the 100 metres dash, the marathon, the diving, the ice skating, the slalom, are highly individualistic. And that's where I think there's this, again, another contradiction. You could say it's folkloric or cutesy. You could also say it's that point where the supposedly excellent individual meets the national imaginary.
Those of you who are film scholars might know that Alfred Hitchcock apparently timed his films at about 90 minutes, which he said was the extent of tolerance of the human bladder. But also...
Do you need a little bowl?
but perhaps also people are starting to think of the refreshments that I dangled in front of you at the start of the talk. So maybe a last question or two, then some relatively economical responses from the panel, and then the refreshments.
I was surprised that the victims of the Cultural Revolution and the existing government of China got together and really made the Olympics something. The designer of the bird's nest was opposed to the existing regime, really. Very surprised at that. I suppose they'll go back to eating deep-fried scorpions now that the Olympics are over. Yeah. Like the Mexicans going back to the bullfighting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And another question, maybe a last.
Just the Toby mentioned about 1936, the Olympic Games. That's the first time to have the TV broadcasting with the PL format. And in the 2008 Olympic Game, that's the first time IOC just submit the internet copyrights in the virtual side. But in terms of the real take part in the real game, the TV broadcasting is kind of the virtual side. So what will be happen for the virtual contribute to the creative Olympics? Maybe just the Toby mentioned for the just take part in the 200 meter for the American team. That maybe happened in the second life. In Second Life, and the Dr. Rowe mentioned about the Chinese media coverage, both in the mainstream media side and maybe the internet community side. So I just working for the Chinese and both Chinese and Australian new media and the traditional sports media. So I know something about very really creative stuff doing in China for the new media industry. So what do the panelists think about what will be happening in the virtual side of Olympic creatives?
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of quick questions there. So for the panel, wish to answer?
You go.
I did actually have something that looked very like a fried scorpion in Beijing. So they're possibly available right the way through. Yeah. I was very struck, and this has a bit of a bearing on virtuality and television and the new media, I suppose, by after the opening ceremony, it's suddenly in the news headlines that this very charming girl who sung so beautifully, in fact wasn't singing, and they'd chosen one girl for her looks and one for her voice, and it was a fake. I thought,
Milli Vanilli.
Yeah, but the whole thing is a fake. I mean, in the sense of being a construct. You know, we don't believe the guy really was able to run around the rim of the stadium. It's a show. And similarly, the fireworks, even more interesting in terms of what is real and what is for television. Right? I watched the opening ceremony with a Chinese colleague in a rather upmarket hotel, much better than the one I was staying in, but it was miles out of town, and what was really frustrating for me was suddenly what looks like the greatest fireworks display in the history of the world is happening, and I can't see any of it for real. So I went out and looked on the balcony, and I couldn't see a thing. Only when I talked to my colleagues, I was there for a conference, who saw the opening ceremony in various circumstances. Some were in the park, and they saw a little bit of the fireworks, but not much. I talked to people who were in the stadium. What about the fireworks display? And they said, well, we couldn't see most of it because it was beyond, we're under the roof. I talked to people at the hotel I was staying in who said they saw a bit of it in the distance. And then, of course, again, the tale emerged that part of it was not happening live. It had been duped into the television coverage. So there was no fully authentic version. Nobody saw a fully authentic version, but television viewers had the best view. Yeah? And we were too close. That's a very odd thing. We are too close to the spectacle to consume it. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Okay.
Yeah, just very brief remarks. I yes agree that sports media, it's one of the most dynamic section in China because sports is not as the political news is so hard in China. And by now, we still think the sports media is one of the most, it's an open place that can criticize a lot for the ministry. So you will find that, especially the internet, now SINA, SINA, which is one of the most, on the top media portal in China, they develop their business step by step according to the every most important mega events. So they become famous after the World Cup, France World Cup. And then they got the profit after the Sydney Olympic. And so every time they got the fast development after each mega events, because only in that section they can broken some obstacle. So you will see the evening news of the soccer nights that can criticize the government very seriously and debate each other, and also that sports commentator Huang Jianxiang accident after the Italian after the soccer rules, that after the second day that there's a very sharp debate in the internet, and you will also see this kind of journalist, the sports journalists of Mr. Li Chengpeng, people we make, they give up their traditional career from the traditional newspaper, become a blog writer, and he can got even more reader than the original. So that's quite interesting things in China that needs to follow the research.
I'll respond to this question here. I'm not really going to make a direct response, but I think it's very important to remember that from say let's say 1950 to 2008, a number of things have happened in China, and that one historical moment, which is a continuing moment. I don't think the Cultural Revolution was 10 years, it's a continuing moment. But nonetheless, it isn't the only thing that's ever happened in China, and it's not the only impact that has come to bear on people's lives. So for people who have lived through one particular part of history to only take that into their response and their relationships with another bit of history is unlikely. So I don't think it's surprising at all that that people work together on some things and don't work together on other things, because there are very complex histories in individual and collective experiences of being in China, because we're talking about China over the last 40 to 50 years. It's not, I was a Cultural Revolution victim and now I'm not going to work on the Olympics, or I am going to work on the Olympics. It's much more complicated than that. And talking to different people during and after the Olympics, there were a number of different responses to the opening ceremony, for instance, and to the whole event, and I think some of them have been very well articulated by my colleague here. But those responses were not forged in only one experience. There are always a few people who get stuck in one moment, either because they haven't been able to move through it for their fault or for other people's fault, or for a collective problem that history work has not been done, memory work has not been done in China around the Cultural Revolution period. That's true, that has not been done properly. There's lots more to be done, and it may or may not get done. And there are some people, particularly artists, who are working on that. But nonetheless, there isn't just this and this. It's as if to say, people who had a bad time in the Falklands may or may not work on the London Olympics. It's not, the connection is not as clear.
I just wanted to finish up from my angle by thanking all of you and also my fellow panelists. And just in terms of this issue of the conventional media, if you like, and the internet, a lot of attention is given to the numbers of persons involved in China and lots of other countries doing what's called the Barbra Streisand effect. You probably know Barbra Streisand has given her name inadvertently to attempts to block internet images because she didn't like various photographs taken of her Malibu real estate being broadcast on the internet, and sought global legal action against this. And now people are trying to do this called doing a Barbara Streisand. Well, China does a Barbara Streisand with the BBC, for example, and lots of other nasty subversive institutions. What was interesting during the opening ceremony at the Beijing Olympics was that NBC did the same thing, having paid, as I said, $9 billion in rights. It had, at least in the Western world, assembled the largest team of internet hackers ever put together to shut down sites anywhere in the world that were showing the opening ceremony live or immediately afterwards. It could be accessed by ISPs in the United States, because NBC was following its policy, which is known as plausibly live, i.e. all events are shown as if they were happening at that moment to correspond with prime time in the United States. That's US corporate censorship as opposed to Chinese governmental censorship. You tell the difference.
Okay, well, I think that was a plausible place on which to finish. I'm standing here because I have a thing about symmetry. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending tonight. Thank you especially Toby Miller for, I think, really giving us plenty to think about, to agree with, disagree with, and so on. And the other members of the panel, Professors Donald, Whannel, and Dr. Qing, for their insightful comments. Thank you to the audience. Thank you again to the Museum of Sydney. Thank you CCR. Thank you Linesman. Thank you Ball Boys. Now I think it's time for. Sorry. Sorry, I'm being abused here. So I'm a member of the panel. Let's have a little more fun. See you outside. Thank you.